Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Today is Monday, May 27th. Happy Memorial Day to everybody. Today we are going to be recapping this weekend of NBA playoff action where we saw both the Dallas Mavericks and Boston Celtics take 3-0 series leads and what seems like they are in a crash course to meet up in the NBA Finals. So we're going to be breaking down the Mavericks Timberwolves games, the conversation around Luka Doncic as he continues on this incredible stretch, fighting through injuries, putting together these performances, and obviously closing them out in the final minutes with some incredible shots, and what the dialogue will be surrounding him headed into the offseason if he were to win the NBA Finals, and whether or not he would be considered the best player in the NBA. On the Celtics side of this, we're going to be talking about their comeback win. Was down 18 points in that third quarter, but they stormed back. Want to talk a little bit about this idea surrounding whether or not the Celtics are in for a little bit of a wake-up call when they do play whoever comes out of the Western Conference, presumably the Mavericks as of this point. But after having a pretty easy schedule in the postseason, whether or not they will be ready when the level of competition does take a little bit of a step up. And then finally, we are going to be ending off the show here talking a little MLB. We saw the unfortunate injury of Ronald Acuna Jr., who went down with a torn ACL on Sunday afternoon. So we're going to be talking about what it looks like for this Braves team moving forward as they try and stay competitive, competing for a World Series. A couple names they could target at the trade deadline, as well as what this looks like for Acuna moving forward as he has torn the ACL in both of his knees in the past few years. But before we dive into all of that, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. To any of our live viewers, be sure to use the comment section. Give us your thoughts on the latest happenings in sports. Try and make this show as interactive as possible. And if you're interested in becoming a bigger part of the show, you can leave a comment on a tip or donation. Your comment will pop up on the screen. You can do so at the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker throughout the show. That is gsmcpodcast.net. Anything would be greatly appreciated there. But like I alluded to, we're going to be starting off the show today by talking about the win for the Dallas Mavericks in their Game 3 matchup that took place last night. Since the last time we were here on this show, the Mavericks took both games, both of which coming down to the fourth quarter and the late game execution of this Mavericks team, and specifically the offense of Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving has just been absolutely tremendous for them. And it just, the Timberwolves have tried a bunch of different things in order to try and slow Luka and Kyrie down, but in these clutch situations, there really is just only so much you can do against them, and the two of them just trade turns. Luka Doncic finishes this game with 33 points, 5 assists, and 5 steals, an improved defensive game for him as well, where, listen, I think that for me personally, Luka's defense is a little bit of an enigma to figure out, because it does seem somewhat reminiscent of the James Harden defense, where a lot of the time he does seem checked out defensively, but when he is locked in, he can make big plays. He has even a little bit more size than James Harden, and I don't mean that that comparison in a negative way. I know that James Harden is known for not being a great defender, but it's about the effort for him. And for Luka, I think especially as he's dealing with all of these different injuries, I understand why he is a little bit less consistent, but this was definitely a positive game for him on that defensive end. Like I mentioned, just sort of getting his hands in on a variety of different plays, helping to lead to the 5 steals. And it was him alongside Kyrie Irving, where the two of them were just down the stretch of this game taking turns, and it's almost the best possible version of where it seems like you look at a team like the Phoenix Suns, who have a lot of individual scorers, and it seems like when they take turns, it's it's sort of disjointed, the flow of the offense as a whole, but something about this combination of Luka and Kyrie is just so incredible to see them working in tandem, sort of pulling out different pieces of this very excellent Minnesota defense, and it just hasn't been too much for the Timberwolves to really get a feel of. And Stan Van Gundy talks about it all the time on the broadcast, this idea of trying to double team these players, and absolutely you want to force the ball out of their hands, but there was one possession in the fourth quarter that I thought was really significant where we did see the Timberwolves send a double to get the ball out of Luka's hands. The Mavericks were sort of passing it around, and you saw that shot clock winding down. It's like, great, this is exactly where they want to be, and then Kyrie has the ball in the right corner, and he ends up driving and hitting a crazy shot. I believe it was with his left hand as the shot clock was expiring, and that's just the reality is, you know what, these guys are so good at individual scoring. There's not an easy solution for it. And for Minnesota, it's interesting because, like I mentioned, this is one of the best defenses we've seen in the past decade, and yet it doesn't really seem like they have the perfect type of defender to guard Luka Doncic as he continues on this stretch where Jaden McDaniels was second-team All-NBA this season, and yet I don't know what it is about him. Something about, I don't know if it's the physicality or what, but you know, Luka can just sort of get to his spots on Jaden McDaniels one-on-one. And to be fair, I think that there are, you know, only a handful of players in the NBA that can make things really difficult for Luka. But it seemed like this Timberwolves team was going to be able to sort of pose some type of a size mismatch, and especially considering the fact that we saw Derek Lively go down with a neck injury in the second quarter, that he was ruled out for the remainder of the game, and we don't necessarily know. Sounds like a lot of it's still up in the air with him regarding whether or not he'll be available for Game 4, but the fact that they do have more size than Dallas, and it just has not played into anything yet. And you saw Minnesota down the stretch of this game playing with the different lineups to try and slow down this duo, where Rudy Gobert was sitting on the bench for a lot of the game. A lot of that fourth quarter, I should say, they were running minutes as well with, it was Karl Anthony Towns and Naz Reid, and then Cat ends up checking out for Gobert, and then eventually they switch again to trying to overwhelm them with size, but it just wasn't enough. And, you know, Gobert has caught a ton of slack throughout this series. The reality is, you know, especially when you have the Luka game winner, if you didn't see Game 2, it was Luka in isolation with Rudy Gobert. He ends up hitting the three over him that, you know, a lot of people obviously have strong feelings on Rudy Gobert. Our host of the basketball podcast, Nelson Jimenez, earlier today, he talked about his dislike for Rudy Gobert, talked about how he started COVID. I don't know if I would go that far necessarily, but, you know, Gobert has been somebody who's been extremely polarizing. I mean, just ask Draymond Green, who has taken, you know, this personal agenda of trying to sort of slander Rudy Gobert while he's on the TNT set through this final series. But, you know, I think that ultimately, like I mentioned, there just isn't really an answer for either Kyrie or Luka. Now, this has been a very disappointing series for Minnesota as a whole. Anthony Edwards, Karl Anthony Towns just have not been good enough. And Anthony Edwards was better in this game, at least. He had 26 points, 11 of 24 from the field. He started to sort of ignite what seemed like it was going to be the Timberwolves pulling off this big run in the third quarter where he scored 12 points. He dunked all over Daniel Gafford, but Gafford ended up being super impactful down the stretch as well with the two-way effort. And again, the fact that the size and the big man conversation was supposed to go in favor of the Timberwolves, and now we're seeing Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford sort of winning those matchups absolutely has to feel like a letdown for the Minnesota Timberwolves. But, ultimately, I do think this comes down to a little bit of the execution of stars. Karl Anthony Towns has really struggled throughout this series. And, he had the quotes post-game where said can't help but laugh a little bit. He's putting up, said something along the lines of, 1,500 shots a day or something like that. We understand that, Karl Anthony Towns is one of the most talented bigs in the league, but there have always been questions with him. And especially when you see him in these games trying to sort of drive and attack closeouts when the three-point shot isn't falling for him. He's shooting just under 14% on 7 attempts per game. So that's been horrendous for them. And then when he's trying to attack these drives, he's really struggling there as well. So only shooting 28% from the field in general. He just has to be better. And as for Anthony Edwards, the Timberwolves tried to make some adjustments coming into this game where Anthony Edwards was guarding Kyrie Irving for the first couple of games. They saw how much of a physical toll it was taking on Ant trying to be the primary defender on somebody like Kyrie. So they end up putting Mike Conley on him. Conley gets into foul trouble, which does also sort of help hurt the fluidity of the Timberwolves offense. And, ultimately, I think that when you look at this big picture, it's just a conversation about who are the players that are postseason ready and are the best closers in the game. Because more times than not, you're going to get close matchups. I feel like the NBA playoffs, by the way, on a quick aside, has been so much better in terms of actually having some of these competitive games this year, where it seems like in years past we've had just tons of blowouts sort of stacking up, but we're getting a lot more competitive games, at least in my eyes, this time around, and that goes in favor of the Dallas Mavericks, where this duo of Luka and Kyrie is just incredible, and there's a reason why they were the number one offensive rating team in clutch situations during the regular season. In 32 clutch situations, they had a 127.1 offensive rating. Meanwhile, the Timberwolves were in the bottom third of the league, where they were 22nd. And we've seen their numbers actually in terms of that specific offensive rating number. We have seen that go up for the Timberwolves in the postseason because they did a really good job in some of those Nuggets games. But at the same time, you're going up against the Mavericks, and they are sort of the clutch kings, and you have Luka and Kyrie that are this sort of a, dominant 1-2 combo in terms of scoring, that it's just been really tough for Minnesota. And you know what? The reality is they're still a young team, and they are going to be back in the near future. That being said, I am curious whether or not we're going to see this exact same iteration. Anthony Edwards is going to be eligible for the Supermax this offseason after making an All-NBA team this year. What they choose to do with Karl Anthony Towns, I do think, is the biggest question around that. But their season isn't over just yet, so I want to sort of hold off those conversations for now. But let me know what your thoughts were on this game and this series moving forward as the Mavericks hold a 3-0 series lead. But we are going to be taking our first break of the show, and when we come back on the other side, I want to discuss Luka Doncic and the run that he is currently on and whether or not a championship would put him at the top of the league in terms of who is the best player in the NBA in that conversation. So again, going to be taking our quick break here. Quick shout out to the Golden Eagle 99 in the comment section. Again, if you are a live viewer, be sure to give us your thoughts on all of the latest happenings. But we're going to be taking our break here, and we will be right back after this quick break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits some mushy shit. A stupid myth, you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Headed into our next segment here, and I want to just sort of run the thought experiment of if the Dallas Mavericks win the NBA Finals, what does that mean for how we view Luka Doncic? Because as great as Kyrie Irving is, Luka really is the engine that makes this whole operation work. And again, not to take away from Kyrie at all. We've been spewing plenty of love for him throughout this postseason run, but I find it hard to imagine that if the Mavericks were to win the finals, anybody other than Luka Doncic would be the finals MVP. And it seems like in recent years, we have sort of developed a little bit of a trend in terms of this who is the best player in the NBA. And it feels like it has been very fluid, and we are always immediately trying to crown the most recent winner. And Nikola Jokic had it locked up where I already thought that he was, but it became somewhat indisputable when he was the finals MVP and he put together the run that he did. But now we do come to this sort of situation here where Luka is in the conversation, and I do think that as much as I stand by Jokic, saying that Jokic was the best player in the league and that he is, but I think that I probably got a little carried away myself in terms of thinking that the gap was as big as it was, because there are other players in the conversation. I think that Luka has to be the other player in this type of a conversation where we saw these were two of the top three finalists for the MVP award. Jokic ends up bringing it home, his third MVP in the past 4 seasons. Luka Doncic ultimately finishes third behind Shai Gilgeous-Alexander as well, but I think that's more so from a team success standpoint, which I totally understand. Mavericks were a 5 seed, so I myself think that maybe I value the team success a little bit more, although it was a pretty close race in the West regardless. But you know, for Jokic, I think you look at the year that he had where once again he was tremendous. 26 points per game, 9 assists, 12.4 rebounds. But if you want to go the sort of counting stats route, that is where Luka really sort of gets his, where he led the league in scoring this season with 34 points per game. And as much as Jokic is absolutely one of the best passers in the league, and in my opinion, the best passing big man in NBA history, you watch the passes that Luka dishes out, and it is just unbelievable. And again, he averaged 9.8 assists during the regular season as well. Neither one of them necessarily elite defensively, although like I mentioned, you know, when Luka does want to have a little bit more of the effort, he can ramp it up some. But I think that this conversation, again, has been a little bit watered down because we do at times get sort of carried away in the moment, and that's something that I always try and account for in terms of recency bias. But you know, the Luka legacy is already really built up. 5 All-NBA first-team selections in the first 6 years of his career, and he already has passed the likes of Dirk Nowitzki, Steph Curry. You can go on a number of different NBA greats, and Luka's already topped them in terms of All-NBA first-team selections. And I don't think that Luka has any plans of slowing down at just 25 years old. He's not somebody who really heavily relies on his athleticism. It's the craftiness, it's the skill that sort of carries his game. So we're already obviously looking at, a legend in the making, but does he have a case for taking the throne from Jokic? Again, I think that we're going to have to start with seeing them win a championship this year. Another sort of conversation piece that Van Gundy has been talking about a lot on these broadcasts is the idea that Luka and Kyrie are the best offensive backcourt in NBA history, which, from an individual skill set standpoint, I can understand the point. Now, Steph and Klay Thompson do absolutely have something to say in terms of that, and I don't necessarily want to dive into all of, those lists just yet, but it's definitely a conversation in terms of individual ability to create shots for themselves and others and close out games, two of the best closers of their respective generations. I don't know if whether or not you would want to consider Kyrie and Luka the same generation or not, but regardless, two players that can absolutely elevate this Mavericks team. Now, it's going to be interesting, I think, to see how they are able to manage the Celtics defense, because I think that the Celtics have just as good of point of attack defenders as anybody does in the NBA, with Derek White, Drew Holiday, obviously as the backcourt, but I would probably expect it to be Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum that are getting a lot of the Luka assignments if that were to be the finals matchup. Now, obviously, we don't know what the injury update is yet with Kristaps Porzingis. I don't think that he's going to be playing tonight. The idea was that he could be available for Game 4, but at this point, up 3-0, do they even necessarily want to risk that? I mean, if he got in and played 10 or so minutes, I don't think that would be a bad thing by any means, but you definitely don't want to force it either. And that being said, I think that as much as Al Horford, who we're going to be getting to shortly in the big Celtics win from Saturday night, but he has been involved in, it feels like, just about every defensive play, especially during that Cleveland series and early on against Indiana, where other teams are trying to take advantage of him as much as possible defensively, and we've seen the way that Luka and Kyrie have been operating this pick and roll throughout the Timberwolves series and how many problems it's given even an all-world defender in Rudy Gobert. So in terms of Al Horford, how is he necessarily going to be handling that? But again, just sort of to wrap up this conversation around Luka in particular, again, I think that it's probably going to take, another year or so of Luka maintaining this. I know that, again, he's been great since the minute that he stepped into the NBA, but in terms of the idea of his game being able to be a championship applicable style of play, which has been a question of the past in sort of the isolation and extremely high usage rates. I mentioned the comparison in the first segment to James Harden. I think that you can definitely make the similarities between the two players in terms of how they choose to operate in offense, but including, I feel like we throw the term maturity around a lot on this podcast, and there is definitely a more team-centric focus that we've seen from Luka over the course of this postseason, being able to understand that he has somebody else that he trusts in Kyrie Irving. I still struggle to say he is completely mature because the arguing with the refs is still absolutely a very prominent thing with him, and it drives me a little bit crazy just watching it. But at the same time, there is no denying the talent level with Luka whatsoever, and he is going to be in that conversation of being the best player in the world headed into next season. Now, I'm not willing to take the crown away from Jokic just yet. Like I mentioned, won 3 of the last 4 MVP awards and has also won a finals in the past 2 years. And obviously it goes beyond, just sort of those individual accolades. If you actually watch the games and see the way that Jokic impacts everything, I still stand by it. But one key difference, I feel like, is the fact that Luka is a guard. He has a three-point shot to his game, so being able to be a primary ball handler like that, and again, it's not that Jokic can't be a ball handler, but that archetype of being a, hands-on perimeter player does lead to more successful crunch time offense, I think, and that's where we're seeing Luka really define himself in this postseason, is coming up when the moments call for it, and he's been incredible there. But let me know how you all feel in the comments section. Again, this is completely subjective, but absolutely it's going to be one of the biggest storylines headed into the NBA Finals. If he can steal this crown, the whole, face of the league idea, it is kind of ironic. Now, this isn't my own original thought. I saw it on Twitter at some point, but the fact that we, as an NBA media, sort of seemed like we were... I myself wasn't really a part of it quite as intensely as others, but the media was trying to crown Anthony Edwards as, this up-and-coming next face of the league, everything like that. And we are likely going to see a Luka Doncic versus Jason Tatum NBA Finals, where these have been the two up-and-comers for years. And I know that, the newest thing is always the hottest thing, but they are both extremely reliable. So we're going to be diving into Jason Tatum and his postseason performance on the other side of the break, because I think he played one of his best games of his career in the Game 3 comeback against the Indiana Pacers. So stick with us. We are going to be right back after this quick break, and we will dive into that Game 3 matchup.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're now going to be talking about the Game 3 win for the Boston Celtics against the Indiana Pacers, where we saw them come back from an 18-point deficit in the second half to win 114-111. Now, there are absolutely a couple different ways you can sort of spin a game like this. A lot of people are choosing to say, well, how are the Celtics down 18 to the Pacers in the first place? No Tyrese Halliburton. So there are things you can be concerned about. I thought that the defensive intensity wasn't necessarily there through the first three quarters. Now, as Jaylen Brown put it, in a post-game interview, he said they had some players that turned into, quote, effing Michael Jordan. And the level of, difficulty on some of the shots that were made, Pascal Siakam, Miles Turner, TJ McCollum, Andrew Nembhard, these were all players that had, great offensive performances for them. Specifically, Andrew Nembhard with a team-high 32 points in this game, a career high for him, 12 of 21 from the field, 4 of 7 from 3, 9 assists. He was getting everywhere that he wanted to in the first three quarters, but it was then Drew Holiday stepping up in the fourth quarter, and Drew, again, it wasn't necessarily his best game ever. He was questionable coming into this matchup with an illness, but he stepped up in a massive way, made some of the biggest plays, including, of course, the steal that he had against Nembhard with 4 seconds left that really secured this win. But have to talk about in this performance Jason Tatum, who was unbelievable for the Celtics. 36 points on 12 of 23 from the field, 5 of 10 from 3, 8 assists and 0 turnovers. This was a masterclass for Jason Tatum. It is sort of a reminder. I'm not saying that his game is entirely predicated on it, but when Tatum does have that three-point shot falling and opposing teams have to commit to him from outside the arc, he's been struggling from an efficiency standpoint from 3 for the majority of the postseason so far, but it does feel like it sort of unlocks him in a full way when the three-point shot is falling. And, you know, it goes beyond that, where we saw sort of the drives and kicks out, the passes that he was making to Al Horford. He was just spamming that behind the back on the drive pass that was just automatic just about every time. And, you know, speaking of Al Horford, he had an unbelievable game where, talked about this earlier, Al Horford just going to turn 38 years old in a week or so, but becomes the oldest player in NBA history to knock down 7 threes in a single game. He finishes with 23 points on 7 of 12 from 3, and it was really interesting to see the level of trust that the Celtics had in Horford during these moments where, I mean, he was coming up in really big spots for them. His sixth made 3 was with a few minutes left. It was wide open on the wing, and I still sort of shuddered at the moment because of the fact that, you know, Horford has had his ups and downs. Now, he was really impactful in the closeout game against Cleveland, but overall he was really struggling coming into this game from the 3-point line, but absolutely comes through in this moment and has shown to be such a massive piece for the Celtics team. And the fact that, you know, they are in this position right now because of the fact, the position being up 3-0 against the Pacers, because he has been able to step up. Because without Kristaps Porzingis, there was a real chance that the Celtics weren't going to be able to keep up with the high-powered offense of the Pacers, but Horford has done enough to sort of hold them in here, and this felt like it would have felt reminiscent to Game 2 for the Timberwolves of having Naz Reid explode the way that he did. I think he finished 7 of 9 from the 3-point line in that game, but he ended up missing that big 3 in the fourth quarter with a couple minutes left. And Horford in this situation, he converts, and it would have felt like it was a, you know, big time slip up to let this game get away from them, especially because when you're looking at the box score during the game, Tatum was playing well. Jaylen Brown, who I haven't even mentioned yet, he was also really impressive with an efficient 24 points as well. And knowing that you were getting this type of production from Al Horford, to not be able to come away with this game would have felt really concerning for them. But they do end up coming back together, and this is the type of game that they would not have won in the past, I don't think. And Joe Mazzulla sort of, it sounds like, during this stretch, kind of got on his players more than we typically see from him, of demanding them to step up, and they were able to do so. Again, it feels like the old Celtics, you can even maybe go back to earlier this season, mentally they wouldn't have been in the same headspace to pull off this type of a comeback in this momentous occasion, sort of understanding that Tyrese Halliburton wasn't playing this game, but the Pacers were at home with an extremely charged up crowd and a team that can still absolutely, you know, get points against you. I know that Tyrese Halliburton wasn't available to necessarily push their pace quite the same way, where, you know, make or miss, Halliburton is always having his eyes up the court, but it did feel like, you know, for whatever it's worth, there wasn't necessarily that same defensive liability. And granted, you know, Ben Shepherd was playing in this game, I thought the Celtics maybe should have looked to attack him more, but Celtics game plan for the first two games was really go at Tyrese Halliburton, who was really struggling on the defensive end, and that wasn't necessarily available to them in the same way. And I do think that, Mazzulla, along with some of, those mental aspects of the game, we saw him, playing a bunch of different lineups. We saw the small ball lineup once again with O'Shea Brissett in, who's somebody who it still doesn't seem like he trusts. Now, I actually, I like the idea of the Celtics potentially having a small ball lineup to potentially run with, but he hasn't necessarily found the one that works yet, and it feels weird that, they're a game away from the finals and they are playing out these different lineups. But there was the Xavier Tillman and Al Horford matchups that was actually having a little bit of success, even if it didn't look all that pretty in the moment. But he ends up, Mazzulla that is, gets super fired up at a mistake that Tillman made and yanked him out of the game. I just thought that he had a really good control over his team throughout here. And, I understand there are still questions with Joe Mazzulla, the head coach, but he has shown tons of growth over the course of this year. And, at this time last season, the Celtics were down 0-3 to a worse team. You can make, I guess, worse team in terms of the talent differential between the Celtics and their opponent. Now, the Heat last year, I think it's debatable, honestly, if they are probably better than this Pacers team because of the defensive aspect, but also, with Caleb Martin doing what he was doing, like, that's not who he is, but he was averaging an extremely efficient 20 points per game throughout that series. But it felt like, there were those third quarter stretches last year in that Eastern Conference Finals where the Celtics were just getting, rolled up on, and they sort of then in turn rolled over. And Mazzulla seems like he is at a place from a personal standpoint where he has elevated the level of this team to another level. And, I think it's interesting. Stephen A. Smith he's doubled down on it multiple times. The take that he has that if the Celtics were to have Ime Udoka as their head coach, they would have already been NBA champions. I think that's a crazy take, honestly, considering the fact that one NBA Finals has passed since then, and the Celtics team last year was never going to beat the Denver Nuggets, even with Ime Udoka on the team. But, Mazzulla sort of writing his own different narratives moving forward here, and that sort of brings us into the idea of the Eastern Conference has been weaker than it was last season, and the Celtics have benefited from a number of other injuries throughout the course of this. Of course, nobody ever talks about the fact that Kristaps Porzingis, their third best player, has also been injured since the beginning of the first round. But this idea of they're going to be moving on here from the Eastern Conference with the possibility of closing it out tonight with their Game 4 matchup that takes place, I want to say that it is 8 o'clock Eastern that they will be facing off. And if they do advance, they're going to be playing a Western Conference team here that everybody has been saying that the Celtics will not be able to hang with. So that is where we are going to be going next here. We're going to be taking a quick break, and when we come back on the other side, I want to talk about the idea of whether or not the Celtics are in for a rude awakening when they do make the NBA Finals and they are out of the Eastern Conference. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We're now going to be talking about this idea that is floating around about the fact that the Boston Celtics may be in for a rude awakening when they make the NBA Finals after having a path that has been admittedly littered with injuries to opposing teams throughout this run. Of course, no Jimmy Butler or Terry Rozier for the Miami Heat in round one, no Jarrett Allen for the entirety of the Cavaliers series, and Donovan Mitchell going down after game 3, and now following game 2, seems like Tyrese Halliburton is going to be out for the series. I have a really hard time imagining that he's going to be back for tonight. We still don't have any official word on it just yet, but having this re-aggravation of an injury that kept him out for a while during the middle of the season, the idea that he is going to be able to make this recovery, I am skeptical. Now, hopefully he can, for, his own sake, but I don't necessarily feel great about that just yet, which, these are all very significant injuries to be piling up in favor of the Boston Celtics. And like I just said, seems like the Celtics are the only team that doesn't get to benefit from the sort of injury excuse, because Kristaps Porzingis is absolutely a very valuable piece of their roster, and they have been without him. And it's been pretty clear through the past couple rounds that they really don't have depth at that center position. Al Horford has been, he's had the hustle plays throughout his time here, but has been getting left wide open in the majority of these games. If you are sort of looking at the box score of game 3, and you can even go back to game 5 as well of the Cavaliers series, of why is Al Horford attempting 12 3-point shots? It's because every single one of them was open just about, because, when you are facing a team as talented as the Celtics are, something has to give. And that has been for these other teams for the most part. We saw it really kick in during this Cavaliers series, that they just were going to live with Al Horford making threes and, just sort of hoping for the best. And Horford struggled from 3 in a lot of the games, but he's had these 2 massive performances in both the closeout game in Cleveland and on Saturday night against the Indiana Pacers. So, that's something that, again, has been big for them in some of these moments, but the clear lack of center play has been something that has made things more difficult for the Celtics. And on the idea of difficulty, it's interesting how, everybody's saying the Celtics haven't been tested up to this point, but they have played in a few close games. There was one against the Cleveland Cavaliers that they ended up winning by 7 points, and that was the game 4 matchup, and that was their closest margin of victory up until this Pacers series, where twice the Pacers have pushed the Celtics to the edge, and not just that, but had leads late in these games that the Celtics were able to come back from. And like I mentioned before, I don't think those comeback wins are ones that the Celtics pick up in, previous years. I think that they have sort of evolved as, the lack of stagnancy. And again, even during the regular season, this was an issue. So if we do get to a point where some of these, crunch time possessions take place and it seems like the Celtics offense sort of tightens up, I wouldn't be surprised necessarily, but it's looked really good in these past couple games. And, even when you go back to game 1 and Jason Tatum misses that wide open 3 from the top of the key, it was a wide open look that was generated off of making different passes. And, I just think that the ball movement has been much improved for them, that is something that you have to feel good about. But at the same time, the idea is that they haven't played. So I think that those are challenges. Those are tests to be able to win those types of games, where the idea is, the Celtics, no team in NBA history, really, for the most part, is going to fully dominate every single game throughout a playoff run. There are just going to be games where, like Jaylen Brown mentioned, they're going to hit shots, and they're going to hit tough shots. And, especially in 2024 with the level of 3-point variance, it's just impossible, I think, to be able to, go on this flawless postseason run. The Nuggets were probably the closest to it last year, but, for the most part, there are going to be instances where even if you are the better team, you're going to be down in a ball game like that, and the way that the Celtics have been able to respond, I think, is huge for them. But all of that being said, they still haven't played necessarily some of the level of competition of these contenders in the Western Conference, where it was being said that the Nuggets and the Timberwolves were, the de facto Western Conference Finals. I think I said that directly. Other people were going as far to say that those are the best two teams in the league and that was essentially the NBA Finals. But as we've clearly seen since then, the Dallas Mavericks are in a prime position themselves to be able to, take this 3-0 series lead against the Timberwolves, and they're probably headed to the finals. They had to face off against a number 1 seeded Oklahoma City Thunder team. So the Western Conference, there's no denying the fact that it is much more loaded than the East is. And there probably aren't all too many things that the Celtics can necessarily take in terms of their success in these past few series as what can they apply to when they play against the Dallas Mavericks, because frankly there's nobody even close that they've played except for Donovan Mitchell, who did play in those first 3 games, in terms of the level of shot creation though that is similar to Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic. And I will say this, there is an idea that the Celtics are only in this position because of the injuries to other teams. I don't, subscribe to that mindset. The Celtics were going to win every single one of those series in my eyes anyways. And, it's unfortunate for the players, but it's almost slightly unfortunate for the Celtics as well that, again, not that they care about narratives necessarily, but that they weren't able to sort of take down these teams at their bests for the sake of approval for fans, which ultimately, like I mentioned, at the end of the day, they do not care about whatsoever. But, I still think that when you look back to last year's playoff run for the Celtics, even though they were far and away the more talented teams than the Atlanta Hawks in the first round and the 76ers in the second round, they still messed around in those series and gave games away. The Hawks pushed them to 6, which was ridiculous because that should have never been the case. The 76ers were better than the Hawks were, but it should not have taken 7 games, and the fact that the Celtics had to come back down from a 3-2 series deficit to pull that one off. So Celtics look miles better than they did last year in the playoffs, and like I mentioned, doing so without, you can debate, honestly, who is the third best player on the Celtics, but one of their key starters in Kristaps Porzingis. And like we saw from Saturday night, the bench production for the Celtics is not super reliable, where Peyton Pritchard has been the one who has given them the most. He only scored 2 points on Saturday, but even still, once this gets to a series against the Mavericks, presumably, I don't know how much he's going to be able to play, because I think that Kyrie Irving and or Luka Doncic are going to go at him repeatedly, which is something that we saw in last year's playoffs when Jimmy Butler just time after time hunted Peyton Pritchard. So he's a little bit of a question mark. Sam Hauser has turned into a massive negative for them, and he's somebody who was reliable for them, and his defense is fine. He's not a negative on defense, but he provides absolutely nothing on offense if he is not hitting threes, and he's getting some of these open looks, but he can't convert whatsoever. So, he's shooting. I'm actually surprised to see that his numbers right now are 35% from 3 during the postseason, because he's looked terrible throughout his recent games. And again, I like Hauser, but I don't know if he's really going to be able to get minutes. So, all of this, you can continue down the list. I think that Al Horford and, you can throw Peyton Pritchard in there. They probably have a 7-man rotation when it comes to this final series. And it does feel like the Mavericks have some more tools that they can kind of throw out there. Jaden Hardy, who I was definitely not expecting to be getting postseason minutes, but he's actually been a solid option for them. Tim Hardaway Jr., we saw him get hot for a quarter. I want to say it was the beginning of the Oklahoma City series, maybe game 2, that he had that big third quarter. Dante Exum, again, just sort of random guys that they can throw in there and can potentially get hot for them, provide a lot of energy. I don't think the Celtics are all that deep. So in terms of, is this a wake-up call for the Celtics? It's going to be their hardest opponent, absolutely. But I don't think it's going to be this, punch in the mouth type of, situation where the Celtics are going to be so unprepared for the Mavericks because of the fact that they've had to play some of these other teams that haven't been at 100%. I think it's going to be a great series. Again, this is all presuming that this does actually take place. The Celtics have a chance to close out the Pacers tonight. The Mavericks have a chance to close them out tomorrow night. I don't see either one of these teams blowing the first ever 3-0 lead in series history, in the NBA history and sports history. Not in sports history because the Red Sox and the Yankees, but I think that ultimately here, the Mavericks can make things a little bit close here. I don't think they're going to get swept, but Mavericks seem like they can wrap this up in 5 or 6 games, and we should be on to an incredible finals. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section, but we're going to be taking our final break of the show now, and when we come back on the other side, I want to dive into the unfortunate news of Atlanta Braves star Ronald Acuna Jr. tearing his ACL that took place on Sunday afternoon. So we're going to be diving into how that affects his career moving forward, the Braves World Series championships, and some names that they could potentially look to go after in a trade to sort of revamp themselves and make up for his absence. But stick with us and we will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We are headed into our final segment of the day, and that is diving into the unfortunate torn ACL of Ronald Acuna Jr., the reigning MVP of the National League, went down on Sunday afternoon. Team was playing the Pittsburgh Pirates. Acuna hit a double to get to second base, and then just a really weird play where, we saw Martin Perez, he threw the pitch, Joe Bart threw it back to him, and sort of during that exchange from catcher to pitcher, that's when Acuna decided that he was maybe going to take off for third base. Maybe he had just sort of fallen asleep, that he had taken a pretty sizable lead moving towards third base, and the sort of change of direction just I don't know, gave in to him, but he ended up his left knee gave out on him, and the MRI confirmed last night that it is a torn ACL and that he's going to be out for the remainder of the 2024 season. And like I mentioned, reigning MVP in Acuna, where he put together a season for the ages, the first ever 40 home runs, 70 stolen bases season, led the league in hits and stolen bases. He had a .337 batting average, 41 home runs, 106 RBIs, a 1.012 OPS, and like I mentioned, 73 stolen bases. So he wasn't having that sort of a same season this year. Career lows in batting average, on base percentage, and OPS. Just 4 home runs through his first 49 games. But it is an extremely unfortunate injury both for him and the game as a whole, because he is one of the most electric players in the league. And it's really sad to see him go through this again, because in 2021 he tore his ACL in his right knee. So just really unfortunate to see how this is all played out for him, knowing that now he's sort of working on 2 knees that have had to go through this type of a serious injury. Now, a lot of people are pointing to his decision that after putting together this incredible year, that he continues to play winter ball. He frequently plays in a winter baseball league in Venezuela. I believe he is Venezuelan. Let me double check that real quick, because I don't want to speak off basis, but it's something that, yeah, he is. And he's really passionate about playing in this league, and it's something that the Braves have allowed him to do throughout the majority of his career, despite even knowing that he had that one torn ACL in 2021. And going to be interesting to see sort of whether or not they do step up and try and shut that down for the future to come here, because Acuna is on one of the most team-friendly deals for a star that you could possibly get. The Braves have been tremendous at going out ahead of time, making sure they lock down these players, and as they continue to develop and as the market continues to rise, that Acuna is on this, cheap deal for his level of production. And maybe for that reason, it seems like, and Acuna knows, obviously, as the MVP, that he is ultimately underpaid and that he might have jumped the gun a little bit on signing this contract extension with Atlanta, but people are wondering whether or not that could have played a role in the fact that, the Braves didn't step up and say no, and that they weren't maybe a little bit more cautious for Acuna playing in these winter leagues. Now, obviously, you can't just point to that. Also, the fact that as incredible as it was to see him put together this historic 40 home run, 70 stolen bases season, it's a lot of steal attempts for somebody who is an integral part of their roster, both in the field and the middle of their lineup. So they need him to be a prominent force for them. And, again, extremely unfortunate to see this happen. Have to feel bad for him, but especially considering that this is his second injury similar to this, you wonder where there could have been sort of wear and tear things, that the aggression that he typically plays with, if that could have played a factor into it, and whether or not it's going to change the style of play that he typically does play with moving forward here. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. It is worth noting here that the Braves did go on to win the World Series in 2021 after Acuna tore his ACL right before, I believe it was right before the All-Star break. And, the Braves are not, they're not the same team, obviously, roster-wise there, but they have expectations since winning that. They were one of the historic best offenses the MLB has ever seen last year, and it's going to be really tough to bounce back from not just this Acuna injury, but also the fact that Spencer Strider, who was one of the favorites for the NL Cy Young Award, he went down after the first week or so of the season earlier this year. So gonna have to continue to sort of overcome these injuries. Now, the fact that Chris Sale he was just named, I believe, the NL Pitcher of the Month. So the year that he's having is tremendous for them and is definitely helping to replace some of that production from Strider. But this is another spot where they are going to have to go out and sort of find somebody to take on that role that Acuna holds for them. And not that exact same role, because you can't just find a star off the streets like that, but at least sort of mimic some of the production that he was giving. And that's going to need to be the case, because as things stand right now, Adam Duvall is their only reserve outfielder. So, and we've seen he's been better in his career as a little bit more of a platoon guy. So not a bad option if they have to lean on him more, but you're going to need to go out and get some additional depth. So have a list of a few names that could at least be looked into there. The first of which is Tommy Pham, currently on the White Sox. This is somebody who the White Sox went out and signed pretty much, it seemed like, for the idea of eventually moving him when the trade deadline comes around. The White Sox are having a horrific season right now. Worst team in the MLB. Record-wise, at 15-39, they have a minus 116 point differential through their first 55 games. So it's been really ugly for the White Sox. If they can, get any type of value for him, and he's on an expiring contract, so I don't think it would cost all that much, and the White Sox wouldn't be able to get a tremendous return. But Pham is hitting pretty well this season. 313 batting average, 445 on base percentage as well in 137 plate appearances. So Pham could be somebody to look to. Jesse Winker is another name where Nationals are in a little bit of a similar situation, not quite as bad as the White Sox are, but don't expect them to be championship competitive. They're going through a little bit of a rebuild right now, and Winker, a former All-Star, a few years removed, could be somebody that the Braves could possibly go out and try and get as a platoon arm. Adam Duvall, like I mentioned, is sort of their option right now. He is a right-handed hitter. Winker you can bring in as a left-handed bat to sort of supplement with Duvall. Ultimately, for Winker, as we've seen this season, really struggled against other left-handed pitchers, which is why he's definitely not the perfect addition for them. But at least in this Braves situation, they could have Duvall to sort of take the lefty bats, use Winker in some instances, because he's hitting 264, 379, 455 splits against right-handed pitching. So we'll see. Again, just a guy that could possibly get moved from an I wouldn't say underachieving team, because again, they're having a fine year, but I think that Nationals fans just understand that they are not necessarily in the position just yet to be a championship competitive team, and I don't think that Winker is going to be the piece that pushes them forward. Have a really good farm system, but now is not the time for them. And last name I wanted to throw out is Brent Rooker. From the Oakland Athletics. He was their all-star representative last year. The A's are having a better year than expected, but still not in playoff contention. The team hasn't necessarily seemed all that committed to investing in the roster, so I can't imagine that there are deadline moves that are going to improve them on the way. So, Rooker at 30 years old doesn't really fit into the timeline, I don't think, of when the A's are going to try to sort of, if they are ever going to buy back in, if they are going to. He's somebody that would probably cost a little bit extra, because I'm sure the A's would be happy to bring him back for next season. Somebody who has good power, can hit 30 home runs in a year. Somebody that the Braves could potentially look to re-sign as well, or if they just wanted to keep him as a one-year rental, they could do so. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. Like I believe I mentioned, they are 30-20. right now, as things currently stand, 6 games back in the NL East behind the Philadelphia Phillies, who have the best record in the MLB. So they're probably going to be in a wild card position, and they're going to need to replace Acuna. And this is definitely, I know that these injuries build up, but they are expecting championships in Atlanta. So again, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. But that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning in to the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Check us out on social media as well for some more exclusive content. You can check us out on the podcast network as a whole. We have tons of other shows, both sports and entertainment. So check out my other co-hosts here. And we are live every 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. So we will be back tomorrow. We will see you then. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet.